Hi students, today we have the poet Sharanya Manivannan with us, and you've all read her poem, The Mothers, today, this week. And so remember I promised you a video, so I'm giving you a video. I'm just going to ask her a quick couple questions. Hi Sharanya. And she's going to answer them for us. And I'm trying to be as coherent. I know I didn't get questions from you guys, but I'm going to pretend like I got questions from you and ask her those, alright? So, Sharanya, welcome.
Lovely to be with you. Lovely to see you, Ranjani. And thank you so much for having, using my work in your classroom. Hi to all your students. I'm sorry I don't know your name, but I hope that you're all doing well in this challenging time.
Thank you for saying that. I know we've all, it's been crazy, and especially with class moving online. So we were originally hoping to do the same thing, except we would do it in class, have you on Skype or WebEx right now. But, we're happy to have you all the same. And I think, it's great because we're not missing out on the experience. They're not missing out on the experience, right? So without further ado, let me jump into the questions I have for you. So all my students have read The Mothers. And so, Sharanya, one of the things that you talk about in the endnote to the poem, and we don't often get endnotes from poets, is, how the poem references the Sri Lankan Civil War and also the Easter Sunday shootings, right? And so can you tell us a little bit about how the idea for the poem kind of came to you, how it sort of brewed in your head?
Yeah. The Easter Sunday bombings happened almost exactly a year in April of 2019. There were almost simultaneous bombs in three cities in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, in Negombo, and in Vatican. I am from Sri Lanka, from Vatican specifically, although I lived only in Colombo at the time. And as a member of the Tamil diaspora, going back is a complicated thing for those of us who left in the 80s or the 90s. My family left in the early 90s. But in the last few years, I've been fortunate to be able to return to the first city of my life and also the place where my roots are in many ways. So I've been fortunate to be able to return quite frequently, and I was in fact in the country a year ago, just before the Easter. And it was a beautiful trip. I was in Colombo, I was in Abhiramam, and I was in Vatican over about 10 days, I think. And I felt so free. There was really a sense that a time in which we could not be at ease had passed. And then, very shortly after my trip, the bombings happened, and they were, of course, a devastating thing on so many levels for so many people who lost their lives, their loved ones, people who then became targets of discrimination and bigotry because of the motivations behind the bombing. And when the bombing happened, I needed a way to hold all these many feelings that I was having, and I found that writing this poem helped me do that. Yeah. So it was very much a response to an immediate event.
Right. And which is why, we're going to be looking at the poet's response section and Rattle too. And I know it's incredibly hard to get in there. And so I want my students, I want all of us to get a sense of sort of what happens in these moments of trauma, right? And one of the things that also catches my attention is in the poem itself, the refrain of, a mother. And it's not the mother. in the titles we've got the plural mothers, and then in each of the stanzas we've got the refrain of a mother. So just sort of an ordinary, regular sort of person, right? And I guess the question is when we think about trauma, how is it that that mother figure sort of appears? And I don't know. I mean, I have my thoughts on it as a poet, but I really want to know what your thoughts are.
It was motivated by something quite specific that someone said to me about how it's a little emotional. About how there would be families who were cooking, preparing for Easter feast, while other members of the household were at church, and this happened, and that really just hit a chord for me. And when events like this happen, events of any nature, including a pandemic, which we're now experiencing, people become statistics, right?
Yes.
And but no one is only a statistic. Everybody is also a story among other things. And I'm sorry, I'm just getting so emotional today. So I think beginning from that starting point of the idea of a woman cooking, waiting for her kids to come back from Sunday school, or waiting for her relatives to come and visit. That was the starting point, and then I thought about what a celebration that day usually is, and how every person who was in one of those churches that day would have been dressed up, would have been wearing their finest, feeling good, looking forward to conversations and to the meals that would follow, and then this happened. And yeah, I guess that was really it. That people are not statistics, and I didn't want to do the thing of using the names or the stories or backstories of actual victims,
right?
Because I think that's very, very delicate. And I remember feeling profound anger last year because of certain photographs that were released in the press of people, who just received the news or who were heading toward the site and trying to find out what happened to their loved ones. And I found the violating nature of photographs like that to be, it was awful, and I didn't want to do that in any form. So I didn't use known stories or so-called real stories. These are all acts of imagination. Every mother in that poem is an imagined mother of sorts.
I think that's also one of the things we've spoken about in class, and that, how poetry, during what seems to be particularly political times or moments, has a sort of humanizing tendency, which otherwise, people, in this time, the power of images is such that, we often find that images commodify people, right? Which poetry doesn't always do. Hopefully, never does, but, it's not a dream world we're living in. So, I think what I love about the poem is that it humanizes these people. And, I'm so thankful to you for sharing something that's so personal, and I'm sure my students appreciate it too. In terms of the form of the poem itself, because that's something we discussed, we do notice that there is a word that's been struck out, which falls in line with what you said, right? Bodies has been struck out with beloved. They're people, they're not statistics. Tell me a little bit about sort of what are the choices that you made in terms of, formal arrangement.
It's a mixed form,
right.
In terms of form. And I think that specific track through was one of the more deliberate choices that I made. And it's exactly for that reason they're not bodies.
Right.
They have beloved. Their bodies only from a statistical perspective and possibly from a medical perspective. But they are people's beloved. And many, many children. I should have mentioned this earlier about why specifically it was the mothers who came to mind for me. But many, many children died in the bombing. And how can you possibly think of a child as a body? It's a baby, It doesn't have to be a little baby, but it's someone's baby. And I think it was that much more so than even though the poem seems to be about the mothers, I think it's actually really about the children. But to return to your question regarding form, it's not a very formal poem. Otherwise, so I think that's about it for me. In terms of there wasn't too much craft with regards to structure, or anything like that. I do want to say this specifically. I am the child of an abusive mother. And under no circumstances do I want to romanticize the institution of family or the role of mother, especially in patriarchal ways. And I hope that my poem doesn't do that. I hope that there is space in between the lines for all these other kinds of grief as well. And if it doesn't fulfill that role, then that's all right. Hopefully there are other poems and other kinds of writing and art which do. But that is something I want to clarify. I don't in any way want to, to uphold that kind of unquestioned sanctity of that role of that institution.
Right, and I think it's so important and powerful that you brought that up, because I think one of the things I do want to tell my students right now is if you do read through the poem, so Sharanya, of course, there are plenty of hints that you've left for us, that you've written about the mother with a bomb, right? So that image stands out for us towards the end of the poem, and it's sort of explicated on with your little note that says, when they went, and I'm reading off of what's written here, when they went to arrest, or is that something? Oh, it is here. When they went to the home of one of the suicide bombers, his pregnant wife blew herself and her other children up. So there is also that notion of, not just trauma as far as the sort of, the victims and the survivors go, but also that sort of taking responsibility and, the mother who's flawed. Right. The mother who has this sort of agenda to keep up with. So I think that's very important. And I think, I'm sure my students are catching on to that. And if they're not, wink, wink, this is a good time to do that. Right. So, Sharanya, I'm going to end this by thanking you so much for taking me through all these important moments. I think if there's something that we love about your poems, it is that sort of these moments of tenderness which are captured in these images. I love that, the starting line, the glass beads looking for another handkerchief, right? The melted candy in the handkerchief and the nose that's been wiped on her arm. And then it goes on like that. A mother whose her other name forgotten, the word is scream in the room at the morgue. right? So you have all these beautiful sort of images, which heartbreaking, tender, right? But yeah, I think my students would benefit from this, and I'm gonna edit it to keep this question separate. But how, if there are my students who are writing poetry, how would you talk to them about craft? How do we get ourselves to this point, like you, where we write these images? What would you say?
That's very generous of you, Ranjani. Thank you. Speaking specifically about this poem, it's an observer poem, not necessarily a witness, but you know, it's through listening, it's through watching, it's through a kind of journalistic approach without a journalist removed,
Right.
you know. And I would say that's definitely how I arrived at the images in the poem, if that helps.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. That's exactly what I'm looking for my students. Thank you again, Sharanya, for being with us.
So much, and I'm sorry for crying in your class too. But yeah, thank you for having me. It really, really is.
Well, thank you for sharing, like I said, those moments, because now my students know that it's real and it's a human exercise to write a poem and bring it out in the world and try to sail on its own little journey, right? So thank you for being there for us to do that.
Yeah, and maybe I should say this. You have to be willing to let your own words trigger you.
That's beautiful.
And it's obviously what happened to me in the course of this conversation we're having. And as embarrassing as that moment was, I also know that it is because I let myself be that brave and be that vulnerable. And I think that is a place that one should not be afraid of getting to when it comes to art, whatever kind of art.
Absolutely. I'm gonna have to frame that quote, right? That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sharanya.